Now, when we think about the student debt in America, who holds this debt burden?
So it's interesting to look at the student debt burden in the United States because there's just a lot of sort of big difference between what many people think of in terms of who has college debt, what college debt looks like, a lot of the stories about college debt, and what it actually is in practice or who has it in practice.
Mm-hmm.
So when people think of college, often they imagine a place like University of Chicago with the ivy walls and the super high private college tuition rates, and they hear about the horror stories of people who owe $100,000+ or more and are completely underwater. The reality is somewhat more complicated. A large proportion of people who are borrowers or who are in student debt have a substantially smaller amount, and that has led some people to say, though there's no actual crisis here, it's not actually a problem. In reality, though, a lot of the people who hold that debt are people of color, people attending community colleges, for-profit schools, places where they themselves are coming from, low income, low wealth, and in some cases are not getting the full bang for their buck, especially if they're going to a for-profit school, which the returns on that degree are often very minimal, sometimes not even higher than a high school degree.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a result of that, while it might be that 80 or 90%, I'm making up the figure here, of borrowers have significantly less than $100,000 in debt. If they don't have the ability to pay it off, it can have significant negative impact on their life, on their career, on the economy at large. And so if you look at, for example, black borrowers, there's a huge equity issue in which black borrowers often, on average, owe more than they originally borrowed 5 or so years out from going to college or getting their degree. And they are, I think something like 50% of black borrowers are defaulting, and even if the actual dollar figures are low, it's a huge crisis.
Mm-hmm. And from what I understand, there's a significant amount of borrowers who are in 5 figures of debt, but they didn't actually complete the college degree. And you get a lot of that financial benefit when you do complete the degree, and whatever the economic or the educational benefit, 2 to 3 years of college is. Getting that diploma is really what gets you that salary boost.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's why one really big sort of change in policy has been a focus on what are called completion grants, with the idea being that that's a really promising intervention in which folks who might end up dropping out, not being able to complete their degree, they're only one semester or 1 quarter away or 1 year away. If someone is able to step in, give them money to actually complete their degree and stay in school, that will have a massively positive effect, much more so than other potential interventions.
Mm-hmm. Have there been any other policies from a federal or state level that have been tried so far to mitigate the student debt issue?
Yeah, there's a few that are sort of ongoing. One that started actually under Trump and has been continued under Biden is addressing something I mentioned before, which is the for-profit schools, many of which have sort of tricked especially very vulnerable populations into borrowing significant amounts of money for degrees that are effectively worthless or that don't match whatever their promises were. So, for example, I'm sure many people have seen ads for DeVry. They're one of the ones that have been under fire. They've advertised job placement rates that are entirely at odds with the reality. And so the federal government, that's been sort of easy pickings politically to say that these students were victimized and deserve to have their debt canceled and eliminated entirely. And so I think just within the last maybe few weeks or a month that has happened. There has also been a lot of conversation lately about bankruptcy and student debt. Student debt is extremely hard to discharge in bankruptcy court. I don't know all the details, but I know that it sort of follows you around in a way that other types of debt does not. And so the Biden administration actually came under a lot of fire for appealing some judgments that would have discharged student debt, federally held student debt. And they recently withdrew those appeals, and now there's a bipartisan movement to get legislation that would change how student debt is handled in bankruptcy courts.
So are there any kind of promising policies under consideration now to help out borrowers who are in a bad situation?
So one of the inspirations for me writing the piece I wrote for the Chicago Policy Review about student debt was that student debt came up within the 2020 election quite prominently, the presidential election, with Elizabeth Warren really leading the way. And I wrote a bit about Marshall Steinbaum and some of the work that he's done, and he actually is the researcher behind a big portion of Elizabeth Warren's plan, and which Elizabeth Warren was running on was probably the most radical plan, which people still talk about and refer back to, which was that because now all these loans are directly offered by the federal government is directly lending it through the Department of Education. She was arguing that it is legal for the Department of Education to essentially go ahead and cancel debt and get rid of those loans and just wipe them clean. And she was proposing doing that up to $50,000. Biden, on the campaign trail, offered something a bit more moderate, a bit more targeted, something more in line with the Adam Looney piece that I wrote about, in which, for those who haven't read my article or haven't read that research, Looney was arguing that student debt relief should be more targeted to those who are lower income. It should be sort of a lesser quantity of debt relieved, et cetera. And Biden ran on that, but so far there's been absolutely no movement, to my knowledge, toward actually canceling debt, besides the for-profit debt cancellation that I spoke about.
So one of the main ones we hear about is the debt cancellation, whether it be, some people want it all canceled, some people want up to $50,000. There's different. What are the pros and cons of the current policies from kind of an economic standpoint?
So I think that in the abstract, Adam Looney is correct. What he is writing about is saying, look, if you look at what student debt cancellation is, it's essentially a government transfer. It's taking money that someone would owe and need to pay off to the government that they borrowed effectively from the government, and wiping it clean. So it's money that the government would expect to have and that will no longer expect to have, and that's effectively a transfer. And what he's saying is that if you then compare it to other transfer programs, things like temporary assistance to needy families or SNAP benefits, things of that nature, it's not a good deal in terms of efficiency. He says that it's better to target those transfers to more needy populations, because a lot of people who hold student debt, who get student debt cleaned away, can afford to pay it off. So why go across the board like that? But, and this is where my Harris School education comes in, there's also sort of that analytical politics, to reference one of our classes, elements of it, where you also need to think about what has a chance of passing, and also look beyond sort of those initial figures of okay, what's the salaries of people who would be getting the debt cancellation, and look at what other impacts it would have. And so what Steinbaum is arguing is that, yes, sure, plenty of people would get debt canceled who could otherwise afford to pay it off, but also all those black borrowers, all those Latinx borrowers that I referred to before, who have been victimized and who are disproportionately underwater, it would help them massively, even if the actual like dollar figures that they benefited from it were lower. So let's say you have a black borrower who has no family wealth and owes $25,000 and gets that wiped clean. In absolute terms, they're getting less money from the government than someone who is getting $50,000 wiped clean. But it'll have a much different impact on their life and their future economic potential to no longer be dragging that debt around. And so his paper shows that student debt cancellation will go a long way towards closing the racial wealth inequality gap in this country, and it's thus worth doing. And he's also, the point he and others have made is that it's much easier to get this passed if it applies to folks who are middle class and above, who are also struggling with this debt, even if they're not struggling as much.
Yeah, it seems like from the analysis that if there was a choice between this or a perfectly targeted towards low income relief package, it may be less effective than that. But since it's not really like an either or for two programs, it's more like, can we do debt relief or not doing debt relief? Doing the debt relief is positive, even if it does help people who may not be in the most needy category.
Yes, absolutely. And I would need to do more research to know how I felt about this. But there's also the question of what's most effective in terms of targeting aid towards those who are most in need, or those who are sort of on the precipice of being solidly within the middle class. A lot of policy research into wealth and race has talked about how the black middle class in particular has been gutted over the last few decades. And this is just me sort of throwing another argument out there, but it's entirely possible that there'd be sort of additional benefits, additional gains to sort of building that black middle class back up that would not necessarily be realized by targeting it solely towards the sort of the poorest of the poor folks within the country.
And now one of the interesting things, if people don't currently have student loans, they may not have noticed this, but there's kind of been a sneaky mini forgiveness, temporary forgiveness going on right now, where since the COVID pandemic started in March 2020, the federal government has actually suspended federal loan payments and also set the interest rate to 0%. So for right now, if you took out if you had a loan as of March 2020, if you paid nothing in the meantime, your loan is the exact same balance, and you wouldn't have been late on any payments. So what does this say about the federal government's ability to forgive these loans, and how does that affect kind of our thoughts moving forward?
I mean, I think it gets back to Elizabeth Warren's argument, which is that the federal government, legally speaking, has very broad powers to enact these kinds of changes. And the question is the sort of political environment and at the moment, and the willingness of those who are wielding power to actually expend capital on doing this. Mm-hmm. And so, I wish I knew more about the politics within the Biden administration behind why he sort of pivoted so strongly away from even the meager debt cancellation he talked about in the campaign trail, because it seems really clearly laid out from everything I've read that the Department of Education would be able to enact those plans if it had the intestinal fortitude to do so.
Mm-hmm. And there's a whole legal argument about whether the president can do this can forgive debt by executive action, or the Department of Education has to go through a process, or if it has to be through Congress. But it doesn't seem that anyone's in disagreement that the president or the Department of Education is able to suspend payments and set interest rates to 0. So is it possible that we could see like a kick the can down the road situation where Biden just says, hey, loans are suspended and interest is 0 indefinitely, and if the next president wants to change it, that's their prerogative?
Given the way that Biden and his administration have operated thus far, it seems very unlikely. It seems to me like there will be that moment when COVID feels like it's passed sufficiently that that payments will resume and life will go back to quote unquote normal.
Yeah, and so these policies are currently set to end on May 1st, 2022. So as of right now, if nothing changes, as of May 1st, 2022, payments will be expected again, and interest rates will go back up. So I guess we'll know more on May 1st. All right, well, Adam, thank you so much for being here today. It was great to hear from you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and hopefully you'll get some more articles in the Policy Review, and we can have you back on sometime.
Absolutely. I have a couple in the works, so we'll see if they make good podcast subject matters.
And even if they're not education, we'll drag you on and make you talk about education anyway.
Oh, anytime.
All right, thanks so much for being here. We have reached the end of our time for today. Thanks again to our guests for joining us, and thank you all for listening. This has been Pencils Down, a University of Chicago public policy podcast production. You can find more of our podcasts at our website, uc3p.org, or wherever podcasts are found. For Pencils Down, I'm Sam Zuckert. We'll be back soon, and I hope to see you all there.